Hey there, guys. How are you doing today? The father has arrived with a new work on the channel, and I'll be honest, it's really good, man. And even more so when the author is known, you know. Volume, cause, and zero mercy. So, without further ado, my son, let's go to the recap. Nobody knew that the ant path in Belokan would lead us to a terrifying encounter. The scent trail, once so confident, was now fading into an abyss of uncertainties, hearing a desperate scream on the 327th floor. The ant that bore the responsibility of her species felt that pressure intensifying. Is it too late? As the instinct screamed for help, a cruel choice imposed itself: risk everything to save a companion or cling to the safety of the group. Well, what to do in the grim grip of the darkness surrounding her? The air was thick with tension, and those ants watched almost paralyzed as the fate of one of them hung in the balance. That internal battle of 327 between being a hero or a survivor echoed in the deadly silence of the underground. Would they be ready for the challenge ahead, or would this be the end of the line? John was descending a basement much larger than he imagined, wondering how far those stairs would go. In the darkness, the only thing he saw was a party of light far away. But deep inside, in the depths of a cave, something was resting there. An insect-like leg stretched out from the creature's body, while more legs emerged and thudded against the ground as the creature began to rise. And so, in the heat of that moment, some creatures that had been hibernating in the darkness began to wake up. Their blood was somewhat frozen inside their blood vessels. It started to thaw, and the colorless, transparent liquid made the bodies tremble so that it could flow again through the network of arteries. The hearts began to pulse slowly as the warm flow warmed the dormant mechanisms, causing the complex joints to start moving. And finally, the first 12 ants awoke, receiving the mission to bring all the others back to the real world, heading towards the vast outdoors in search of thermal energy, breaking the seal they had placed on their den as soon as they left. At only 1 millimeter in height, they had built an underground city with over 50 levels and another 50 above ground. Wow, this was the largest city in the region, with about 18 million inhabitants producing annually 50 liters of stove syrup, 10 liters of cochineal syrup, and 4 kilograms of oyster mushrooms, along with a ton of discarded stones. There were 120 kilometers of functioning tunnels and a surface area of just 2 square meters. That's a lot, right? For such a small space, it was an immense fire ant city called Belokan. The 12 ants that woke up in the gigantic Belokan had an important task: to reactivate the city that had remained stagnant over the winter. The first to wake is instinctively guided to bring back the warmth of sunlight to the den for the companions who are still asleep. Among these 2 ants, there was one solitary male ant, the only one that could reproduce, and not the only one that could leave a like. Right, my boy? Go ahead and leave a like there, scraping this video. He was a bit smaller than the other ants from Belokan, and his upper mandible was narrower. His name was number 327, and his fate, well, it was sealed. He would die in a few months. 327 began to share his warmth with a worker ant that was still in her deep sleep. That worker ant, upon being awakened, extended her antennas in an attempt to identify who had stirred her. The first segment of information she received stated that she had 173 days of life. The second segment revealed that she was a fertile female, while the third highlighted that she was a forest fire ant, born in the mother city, Belokan. The fourth segment provided her egg number, which became her name, counting from the beginning of autumn. She was 327. The egg that had been, therefore, she was known as the male ant 327. From that fifth segment on, she no longer emitted chemical information, yet each one still performed its function. Those new ants waking up joined those who had already awakened to rouse the dormant ones and repair the structures of the city of Belokan, while 327 carried a twig weighing about 60 times her own weight. Wow, that's a lot. A soldier ant approached her, presenting a proposal inviting her to go hunting with him. 327, curious, wanted to know what they were hunting. That ant replied that it had found meat before winter arrived and began to explain that they were in a location 23 degrees west of noon sun. Upon tasting that atmosphere, 327 realized it was leaf beetle meat. Although she was confused, after all, the beetles should be asleep at that time. But that ant explained that the meat came from a special area, a place that, due to the subterranean water, was warm, and there was no winter there. This took 327 by surprise, but she agreed to go with him. Inside the ant nest, the ants gathered with a soldier, reporting that a new season was starting, and that 28 explorers had been selected. they would set out for the glorious first expedition of the Locan ants. The group of explorers was well prepared for that long journey, their abdomens full of formic acid, and their heads equipped with extremely powerful weapons, among them 327. That ant was the only reproductive one of that expedition. The plates, like the innocuous armors of the soldier ants, still bore the marks of several battles. You know what I mean? Thus, they marched for hours on end, passing through several sister cities of the same federation, all belonging to the dynasty that didn't even have Hotelubequem, which produced the largest grain, and Juliacom, which sent a brave army of soldier ants to conquer the southern Compans 2 years ago. The Zabanikan, a chemical laboratory that produced formic acid, of high concentration, and a lubricant that fermented the cochineal sap, generating alcohol with a resin flavor. Those fire ants only inhabited cities like this, but they could also unite and form federations. Belican was part of a relatively new federation, only 50,000 years since the first dynasty was established. It is said that the first queen got lost in a terrible storm and ended up wandering into this land. She sank the cake, and over hundreds of generations, the queens of the dynasty that hadn't even been born created the federation known today. The ants from that expedition passed through there, saw Lacan, the westernmost branch city of the Federation, and reached a small hill. An ant started commenting to 327 that once the hunt and the war began, that patch of grass would be filled with soldier ants, and that the city they were heading northward was the enemy city, Gaifu. Fortunately, the enemy should still be sleeping during the winter, so they would continue marching toward their destination without any fools around. Their adventure was just beginning. One of those ants gave a nudge and said that the scent trail guiding them ended right there. From that moment on, they would have to follow the marks left on the ground. Out of nowhere, a deafening scream cut through the air, making everyone turn to see an ant caught in something. 327 jumped into action and said they needed to save her, but was, interrupted by another ant who explained that once the ant was led by the scent of a sandal, the rescue was impossible. The only thing they could do now was leave a warning sign for their kin and continue their way west, abandoning that captured ant. As they kept a keen eye on the possibilities and potential threats, another ant noticed a pheromone marking the entrance of a cave. That seemed to be it. They had finally reached their destination. At that moment, they spotted a stream of water, a hot spring. All the ants rushed toward that warm water, but suddenly the ground began to tremble. When they noticed a huge rock rolling towards them, the leader asked them to calm down, explaining that it was a dung beetle, and it was better to let it pass, as its taste was horrible and its shell heavy. It was just a hassle to carry that back to the nest. Then, without warning, something crawled over their heads and came face to face with a silverfish. An ant started saying that it had an amazing taste, and everyone began to attack it, pouring formic acid on that creature. Those ants ambushed the insect and devoured its tasty flesh. Then, the leader told them to eat and regain their energy. Thanks to that thermal spring, there were even more delightful treats awake around. But suddenly, something enormous fell from the sky near them. A terrifying shadow revealed itself, a giant bat. The ants were stunned as the bat thrashed about, throwing rocks in their direction. 327, in despair, asked the leader how they should stop the creature's attacks, fearing it would kill them and swallow them. The leader then explained that they were dealing with the bat, informing them that it was only screaming and showing off because it was afraid they would invade its territory. Then, the leader ordered everyone to shoot formic acid at the bat. Thus, everyone began the attack. When that acid hit the bat, it felt suffocated, going into its mouth and eyes, causing it to retreat from the ants. That formic acid, at 40% concentration, worked. Almost like a corrosive, when it touched a silverfish's body, it fell apart, and even a colossal bat could only afford to flee. In the following days, the 27 ants of the Balokan expedition explored the warm caves and collected supplies. They spread out, releasing pheromones from their rear glands, as if they were planting a flag in conquered lands, leaving behind chemicals that marked the territory of the Balokan Federation. The first expedition group of the season, with 28 ants, successfully completed its mission to expand. The Karsa land and its relatives, besides the Western Grove, the ants were now hurried to return to the nest, as they needed to reach that city before sunset. Once night fell and the temperature dropped, their bodies would become stiff. In March, during autumn, the ants could operate as champions, day and night, non-stop, but with the low temperature, they began to slow down and eventually fell asleep. That's why expeditions lasting more than a day were rare, and the fearless ants were taking that risk. At that moment, one of the ants sensed a curious smell. They suggested pulling up that plant and bringing it back to their queen. One ant's idea caused everyone to gather, and the discussion about pheromones started circulating among those ants. The ants debated that their queen mother did not know that type of plant, and that, if they did not handle it with proper care, it could cost them their lives. Then one said that even if he tried to take charge of it, he did not have enough ants, while another said that learning to master those carnivorous plants could become a great triumph for their federation. Just the act of planting a row of them would strengthen their defenses. The leader finally told everyone to gather their pheromones, claiming they were exhausted and that the sun would soon set. Thus, those ants decided not to approach that carnivorous plant. However, as they walked, they found some daffodils, realizing how beautiful those flowers were. 327 then commented that the Queen Mother would have immense joy if they brought this to her. They left that flower behind and decided to pick another. While cutting the flower from the stem, he was sure others would say he had made a great choice. Now, all that was left was to reach the group, but just as 327 was almost close to joining them, he saw that all the ants were dead, their bodies shattered and crushed on the ground. He could not understand what had happened. Trembling with fear, like a green twig, 327 wondered what had occurred there. He noticed that the ants had fallen. In the snakehead formation, not a single formic acid had been discharged, which meant they had no time to emit an alarm pheromone or to form battle lines. He hoped there might still be some clue in the antennae. Upon touching them, he found nothing, leading him to wonder how that was possible. Then he noticed foam coming out of their mouths, took it, and hoped there was something there, bringing it close to the head and rubbing it over the body. Then, 327 lightly shook his clean antennae at a rate of 300 vibrations per second. Wow, that's a lot. When he couldn't perceive anything, he shot a frequency to 1,000 and then to 500 and then to 2,000 vibrations per second. At an extremely high speed, a new universe of almost invisible particles emerged before him, with steam rising from the dew, while contentious pores danced in the air. And that's when the guy felt it all. 327 recognized that smell. He had felt it before. Forcing his memory, he shot his antennae to 12,000 vibrations per second, seeing the suction current that pulled everything around him. Now it clicked. It was the Chigafu dwarf ants that were nearby to the north. Surprised they were awake from their slumber, he thought they might have prepared, hidden, and used some new and fast weapon to eliminate his friends in an instant. He needed to run to warn the gang about the trouble that was coming. 10,000 years ago, the queen of the fire ants from the extinct Nashia Gay, Stenga, man, that's the name here, was obsessed with discovering where the world ended. So, she sent repeated expeditions to the four corners, but none ever returned. That current queen, Belo that Kune, had a different style. She was just happy to have found a little golden beetle and to observe some carnivorous plants. She also believed that one day she could tame those beauties in her head. The best way to explore new territories was by expanding the Federation, launching more distant missions, establishing new outposts and forward bases. This meant a constant war against any and all resistance to the growth of their territory. Conquering the edge of the world was a distant dream, but the ants' motto was clear: slow and steady. Thus it goes far. The setting sun was painted like an orange egg in the sky. The 237th male of Queen Velocicune had just witnessed his companions being decimated in the first hunt of spring. Around him, in fear that the enemy would track him down and eliminate him, he ran uncontrollably back to his colony. On a day like today, the colony felt closer and more welcoming, yet also at an unbearable distance. As he ran as if there were no tomorrow, he wondered how the Shigifu dwarf ants were already awake. The winter slumber, terrified, pondered what kind of new weapon they had created, one so powerful that it eliminated 26 comrades in an instant, without a sign. This is too much, he told himself. If he could make it back home alive, he would see his family, his mother, and the sole purpose now was to get home. Replacing the warmth of the sun, a bright light began to emerge on the horizon as the 237th crossed the dark basement, resembling caves. His breath was ragged, and he was sweating. He watched as the enormous caves unfolded around him. The guy tried to keep calm. He couldn't. Let fear take over. So he pressed on through the corridors, gasping for air in hopes of finding it as he delved deeper into the bowels of the colony. But elsewhere, a scent trail came to an end, as the welcoming aroma of Belacan beckoned the 237th like a beacon. Poor thing, exhausted and panting, he finally reached his beloved home. The top of the Belacan city was undergoing renovation, adding another layer over its curvilinear roof. Elevating to a height that reached the stars, 327 realized that night had fallen and the moon shone radiant in the sky. but the other ants were quickly preparing to retire as the sun bid farewell and the air began to cool. So, it was time to close the doors before the cold entered. But just as they were about to close, a voice called out to him, "Alberto, 327. He was in a deplorable state. One ant was stunned by the voice that crackled, wondering if he was just a lost ant wandering around. But 327 quickly defended himself, claiming he was a warrior ant. The ant was shocked to see him so worn out, commenting on how he smelled of exhaustion. Realizing the critical situation he was in, a worker ant offered to share his food with him. 327 accepted, slowly lowering his antennae. He could barely stand. His body was about to seize up. The ants pressed their mouths against each other, acting as if it were a social stomach. Wow, what a strange thing. The worker ant passed a porridge-like food as stored sustenance to the other comrade who was in rough shape. 327 thanked him for virtually saving his life. Then, he shot off to recount what had happened on that expedition, shouting that there was no time to waste because something terrible had happened, and he needed to alert them about that emergency. But that war was approaching. The other ants didn't understand what was happening, as 327 explained that the dwarf ants had decimated his first group of hunters, revealing that they had a new and deadly weapon, highly effective. He then summoned everyone for combat situations, yelling that the war had begun. As the ants began to gather to hear what 327 had to say, doubt hung in the air and they started demanding proof, questioning whether he had any evidence of what had happened, whether his story was indeed true. Then they asked 327 where all of this supposedly occurred. He replied that it was to the west of La Solicum, right between their cities and the new hunting grounds, where scouts had reported that the dwarf ants patrolled those areas from time to time. Those ants were skeptical, doubting the information presented, claiming that their own patrols had already checked that area and confirmed that the dwarf ants were still in their reserves, calm and untroubled. 327 had striven so much, yet his words seemed to go to the wind. You know what I mean? The ants began to disperse, criticizing him for his unproven claims, suggesting that he was just tired and that his mind was confused. Who in their right mind would think that an attack would happen while some of their sisters were still in a deep sleep? It was a foolish thought to say the least. For 327, who was the only one who would come out alive from that first expedition? It made no sense at all. The crowd's choice to believe in anonymous rumors instead of him was a stab to the chest. You know what I mean? He wondered how they could doubt him, the one who had faced danger and returned to save them. 327 felt indignant, pleading for them to check their divisions, where they might find the missing ants. This should at least align with the truth he was trying to convey, but the crowd did not respond, ignoring his words as they continued with their daily routines. That indifference was insane. No one even cared, and 327's heart ached because of it. He could not give up. He was the last survivor, and the memory of his fallen companions was alive in his mind. He needed to wake his people at any cost. However, his attempts to raise the alarm only generated annoyance among the other ants, who were nothing more than an irritated bunch, telling him to stop bothering them and to stay in his lane. With the weight of the other ants' disdain, 327 decided to return to the cave in silence. There, Lucy was staring at the basement door. Tense and nervous as Kiki, worried, mentioned that a good amount of time had passed since their father disappeared down there, questioning if it wasn't time to call the police, but their mother remained in deep silence. Edmund Wells's words floated in her mind. One day they might guide her destiny, but the hope was that this wouldn't happen anytime soon, as what could come to light might bring serious dangers. He was right. Something terrible was on the horizon after all. Every secret was bound to emerge from that darkness where it was buried. My time is a cruel enemy, you see, when it comes to secrets. For anyone reading those lines, he presented himself in spirit. It had been a long time since he had departed, perhaps a decade or even a century, and so he closed his book, the lost encyclopedia of relative and absolute knowledge. He stood up and turned off the light, plunging the room into that darkness once again. Well, no one believed that guy, not even a comma of what 327 had said, but the idea of telling the queen began to boil in his mind. He decided it was worth reporting the situation to Alok Kun. After all, while most ants lived around 3 years, the Queen Mother had survived 14 winters, laden with glorious experiences accumulated each season. He hoped she could see him, and so 327 ventured down a corridor where thousands of worker ants, tense and focused, were transporting eggs from the 40 level underground to the sunlit nursery on the 35 level above ground, maneuvering around the ants staring at their precious loads. He entered a side tunnel that seemingly led to the city's nervous center. In the absolute darkness, his infrared perception helped him move safely. As he approached that restricted zone, the scent of the mother grew stronger, and he began to spot more guards along the way. With all this, that little ant had an aroma that acted like a pass, allowing him to pass unobstructed. This was the last corridor leading to the Queen Mother's main chamber. Before another guard, sensing his scent, he motioned for 327 to proceed, and then he finally entered the Queen Mother's chamber. It was a vast room infused with her scent, responsible for the creation of all the colony's eggs that provided life to every ant in that underground. The queen, who had led numerous wars during her reign, had even conquered the cities of the southern termites. She had broken all longevity records, being the very mother of 327, the majestic Valokuni, queen of the central fire ant city. Her large, round eyes and elongated head displayed a fearless spirit. The notably spaced antennae on her sides gave a special aspect to that figure. A nurse ant was always ready to pick up and care for the new eggs that the queen laid. Upon detecting the nuances of the scent, 327 realized that only non-reproductive males and soldiers were about to hatch. The daughter granules were inactive due to the cold, but when the weather improved, the queen mother would lay the eggs in a quantity proportional to what the colony required. Then, Valakuni asked 327 to come closer. Happy to see her son visiting her, she welcomed him as one returning to the womb of the people. 327 might have left his mother's embrace behind, but the first rule of the hero was never to fail to return. As a true explorer, he became the legs and eyes of his colony, always in search of new paths. But now he was returning with the mission to awaken his people, who were still immersed in a deep sleep. Upon seeing his mother's eyes, a flame of hope ignited in his chest. She believed in his story. Our boy was radiant as he realized she trusted his visions and intuitions. Valakuni did not hesitate to assure him that he was right about what was to come. However, there was a catch. His pheromones had not been enough to convince the others. She knew her communication skills were limited, but the presence of the queen could bring the truth to light. That's why she was there. She spoke to Kuni, sensing the signs of death and wearing something inexplicable on the antennas of 327. She confided that a path was approaching, although it might lead nowhere. Regardless of its truth, she could not decide alone. In their city, every decision was crucial and required everyone's approval. Our boy emphasized that this was the most urgent challenge he faced and requested that spies be sent immediately to discover what the secret weapon threatening their colony was. However, that queen retorted that there were a multitude of priorities that needed immediate attention. After all, the awakening of winter was still underway, and the repairs outside the city were just the first steps. But it didn't stop there. They urgently needed protein and sugar, in addition to preparing for the Festival of New Life. Even if she wanted to send her ants to investigate, there simply weren't enough troops. Falakikuni, stressed, took a moment to play with the carnivorous plant, wondering if she could build fences with those creatures to protect the northwest border. All in all, there was a serious problem. These plants still couldn't distinguish the city dwellers from the intruders. 327, troubled, asked about the comrades they had lost in the last expedition, and the queen asked for details on how many ants had succumbed. Upon hearing that it was about 27 and that they had not survived, she wondered if they were all explorer soldiers, actually a vital subclass for the colony. 327 confirmed, pointing out that he was the only male among the lost. The queen became thoughtful as she laid another egg under the care of a nurse who was always by her side. The site of value, Kikune, depositing 27 new eggs to replace those that had failed in battle. Leaving 327 amazed with nothing more to say, young Ant walked away from the majestic queen, bitterly disappointed with the way that conversation had unfolded. He could not simply dismiss the deaths of the other 27 ants. No! He felt he needed to uncover what new weapon the dwarf ants had used during the fateful expedition. The problem, of course, was that his ceremonies were not strong enough, but that didn't mean he was going to give up so easily. The plan was in his mind. He would find a way to convince them. 327 then released his pheromones again, informing everyone that the entire expedition had been wiped out in the ambush by the dwarf ants. The ants, however, were annoyed, claiming he was being too noisy and sending him away because they were busy. As everyone dispersed to get back to work, 327 was in shock. No one was listening to his warnings, and he began to question what he should do. It was time to act. He needed to alert them about the danger somehow. Then, a movement caught his attention. Turning around, he noticed someone limping, following for quite some time. 327 identified a young soldier, but there was something peculiar about that scent, a different aroma, mixed with the characteristic odor of the ants. Belican had a smell of stone in the air. When an ant approached, he turned to ask who it was and what her purpose was, only to find a silent figure standing in the shadows. Our boy quickly understood that the situation was quite dire. He thought about running, but was blocked by another ant that appeared from the other side, staring at him with an intimidating intensity. My friend, the smells were mixing, and he realized that this new ant also carried the smell of stones. Before he could react, they started to run towards him, surrounding him with open mandibles. They began to bite him as he pleaded that he was not an enemy and that he was one of them. Our boy released yearnings of his pheromone, trying desperately to convince them that he belonged to that colony, but one of the ants picked up his scent and started rubbing its antennae, cleaning away what might be passing for his identity. Damn, the guy started to panic, knowing that without his scent, he was nothing more than a shadow in an unknown nest. Terror overtook him, and he began to question whether this was his time to disappear from this world, unaware of why they were trying to end him, vanishing in such a silent way from existence. But suddenly, the ground began to vibrate and 327 was completely shocked by the earthquake. In the midst of that darkness, a terrifying door appeared. In front of it, a man was staring at him with a vacant and concentrated look. He was so focused on the door that it seemed he could sense something just with his gaze. Then suddenly, a bright light interrupted above him, catching the monster by surprise. Jonathan's wife suggested they fix the entrance light switch, recalling how her husband had been the first to turn on the lights, but now he was there, motionless. She asked if he was afraid of the dark again, telling him to get over it, as he was no longer a child. Jonathan replied that his body simply froze, and that was why he couldn't help. He even mentioned that he had quit his job because of it, even knowing he had no money left. He insisted he hadn't resigned, but in the end, he was fired, which made his wife let out a sigh. Still, she felt relieved that her uncle had left a house this big, and now, with a house like this, it felt like a dream come true. Jonathan was happy that life always found a way, reassuring his wife that he would soon find another job. Then, at that moment, their son and the dog came running in, asking where his room was. His mother pointed out that his room was to the right at the end of the hallway, and the boy dashed off with his dog while his parents smiled at seeing him so excited. The boy was amazed to see his room, commenting on how big it was. Jonas told Nicholas that it really was his room and to not worry if he didn't like it. Could you look at the others too? Nick confessed that he loved his new room, but he still wanted to check out the others. While he was running with his dog, Jonathan felt happy watching his son having fun. His wife then questioned what kind of person the uncle was, curious about how close he had been to the nephew to leave such a large house in the suburbs near the Fontainebleau forest. Although it was a basement level, it was still 5 times bigger than the place they lived in before. John admitted that he didn't remember much about his Uncle Edmund. He was the only one from his mother's side of the family, and according to his mother, he always watched with interest, caring about how John was growing up when he was little. Recently, his uncle used to hold him upside down, pretending he was an airplane, but John was so scared that he would end up peeing on Edmund's face. That was the only memory he had of that day. Don's wife, upon hearing how fearful he had been even as a kid, then asked what his grandmother had said, since he had mentioned that he would go see her to ask about Uncle Edmund. John tried to recall her words, but before he could, he saw Nick trying to open the door. The door was quite old. Then, Nick started banging on it, with his dog barking as if it had seen something. "My brother, stop that," he saw. He noticed there was a padlock on the door, but there was a crack, so he decided to try to look through it into the room while his dog kept barking. John told him not to open the door, but his wife also showed curiosity. It looked like a basement. While they were peeking, an excited Nick said that the new house had a basement. Nick suggested that they should open the door, and his mother agreed, wanting to see what was inside. But John then shouted for them not to open the door, making the whole family and even the dog turn to him. John explained that the door should never be opened, and his son asked, "Why not? Why couldn't he do that?" And John looked at him with a nervous expression. "You know what I mean?" But his wife also questioned why they couldn't open the door. John tried to justify it, saying that the basement was filled with rats, making his wife panic by suggesting he should run and lock that door immediately. There you go. See? At night, the whole family slept peacefully, but John remained awake, sitting at the dining table. This guy was focused on an envelope, reminiscing about his grandmother's words, who said that his uncle Edmund had left a letter for him, asking what kind of person his uncle was. He questioned his grandmother, and she replied that he was a very special child, saying that from a young age, Edmund caused a lot of trouble, starting with toys and then messing with clocks and audio equipment. Look, there was even a time when he tampered with the refrigerator and they ended up throwing away all the food. He ruined everything, my brother. The guy was curious. There was also a time when he built a hideout inside the house and stayed hidden in there. Look, even his patient grandfather reached his limit with that Edmund's antics, ultimately destroying the boy's hideout completely. From that incident, everything changed between him and the family. Jonathan remarked that all kids were like that when they were little, you know? But the grandmother replied that the situation worsened when Edmund became a student. She asked if Jonathan would like to hear more about it, saying that his mother always said his uncle was a genius. His grandmother said that his mother, Sylvie, really believed that. John's grandmother, with the look of one who had seen it all, knew that her brother was not just a troublemaker. In fact, he was a being out of tune with the world around him. This statement left John somewhat lost as she handed him a puzzle that Edmund had made when he was just 11 years old. It was a simple task, to create 4 equilateral triangles using 6 matchsticks. John, confident that he was good at these things, set out to solve the problem. But after several frustrating attempts, he asked his grandmother for help. Only. Then did the old woman reveal to him that Edmund, at 11 years old, had a peculiar way of thinking. He always said that to find solutions, it was necessary to see things from a different perspective, because if one simply followed common methods, I would never be able to uncover the mystery. Then, Grandma took a box and mentioned that Edmund had left a letter instructing that, if anything happened to him, that message had to reach John. With curiosity, he opened the envelope and read Edmund's warning. Above all, never go down to the basement of the house at night. Well, the sound of the creaking door echoed in John's mind, but the next morning, he hurried out to run some errands. His wife was furious about having to leave that day. No? Shortly after that move, Nick also didn't hold back and blurted out that he had a bunch of boxes to unpack. John quickly apologized, explaining that the meeting he needed was only that day. He remembered his wife also had commitments, which made Nick feel betrayed. Before leaving, they reminded Nick not to open the door for strangers, no matter how much they called. Meanwhile, John was admiring an old photo that was in Grandma's house. She explained that it was just an image of her with her mother and uncle in their youth. A curious person asked how her uncle had died. The grandmother, with a sad look, recounted that he had been stung to death by wasps. Poor my brother. And that had been such a shocking event that it made it to the newspapers. The authorities said they had never seen a body with so many stings. A shock dose for John, my brother, who stood there processing all that information. What a shock. He wondered if there was anyone else who knew his uncle well, and Grandma mentioned a childhood friend who used to be around all the time, John Jules Bransley. In the present, John soon found himself in front of a large man, asking if he was Jules. Jules invited him in, and as he served tea, they began to exchange ideas. Jules pointed out that Edmund had always been a living mystery. No one could deny that. They had studied together, him in the field of botany, and Edmund focused on bacteria. John was confused about his uncle's specialization, but Jules continued. The guy claimed that this research was for people to understand their ancestors. Deep down, what Edmund wanted was to decipher the cells in their most primitive state, because he believed that we, humans, were just a bunch of cells, and he was really right, wasn't he? And for him, it was essential to understand the psychology of each cell. Jules didn't know how to explain it, but he felt that Edmund was truly exceptional. Meanwhile, John revealed to Jules that he had heard his uncle was writing an encyclopedia, which made Jules's face light up. On the way home, a doorbell rang. Nick, even while looking through the peephole, saw a man introducing himself as GNU. He was there for work to bind books. Nick barely opened the door, trying to shoo the guy away, but the man was not intimidated. GNU asked if there were no adults at home, mentioning that Professor Wills had requested binding services. Nick explained that Professor Wills was his great-uncle, and that he had passed away a long time ago. Then, he tried to close the door, but GNU stuck his foot in the door, not letting the situation end there. He expressed his condolences for that loss, but then began asking Nick if Edmund left behind any large volume of documents. Jules, who was quite excited about that encyclopedia idea, commented that it was an ambitious plan, just as Edmund truly should be. John asked if Jules had seen this encyclopedia, but Jules fell silent. Meanwhile, at home, GNU was still trying to hold the door, urging Nick to check if Professor Wills had left anything. He emphasized that even with the uncle's passing, promises carry weight. He thought something significant must have been hidden around there. This material, he said, was something Edmund would call the Encyclopedia of Relative and Absolute Knowledge. Then, with a desperate look, Jules wondered if John was curious about the encyclopedia, concluding that he had seen clues about it, but believed that Edmund had probably hidden it very carefully like a treasure. Satisfied with that, John returned home. However, Nick, somewhat frustrated, slammed the door hard, claiming that if something like that encyclopedia existed, he would have already found it, which only made the genius even angrier. Then John decided to ask Jules if he had any idea how to make 4 equilateral triangles with 6 sticks. To his surprise, Jules replied that he did, saying that Edmund always used this challenge to test people's intelligence. John then got super excited asking how to do it. Jules explained that he couldn't just hand the answer to John, as Edmund always said that everyone should find their own way. All pumped up, John then passed the letter he had received from Edmund to Jules, asking him to take a look. Jules took the note with a curious look, asserting that it was definitely Edmund's handwriting. When John asked about the basement, Jules replied that, unfortunately, he hadn't heard anything about it yet, leaving John disappointed. Poor guy. However, Edmund left a message. He needed to follow the instructions to the letter. That night, the basement door creaked again as the dog and the air kept barking non-stop. The door began to roll under the pressure of the air, growling, and when least expected, it opened, releasing a terrifying noise. The next day, John was shocked to hear that the air had disappeared. Poor Nick claimed that it was nowhere to be found, with a sad expression. John asked Nick to stay calm and continue the search a little longer. Then, his wife called him, saying she was quite certain that the air had gone down to the basement, pointing to the floor. She showed that there were piles of fur balls right at the basement door, leaving them stunned. John, on the other hand, asked them to calm down, insisting that the air might have left. His wife retorted that this was impossible since the front door had been locked the whole time. A son joined the conversation, agreeing that the air had definitely gone to the basement. He said it was time for John to use what he learned from his old job, urging him to be quick and open the lock with everything he had. John hesitated, remembering that it was prohibited to enter the basement. His wife questioned why they couldn't exactly go in there, and, as they debated, the warnings from various people about the basement flashed through John's mind. Increasing your dread, She then pointed to the crack in the door, stating that it was big enough for the air to pass through, teaching that he was probably there because that hole was too big. He could get through it. Even so, John was visibly nervous, staring at that door, terrified, as his eyes fixed on the darkness he glimpsed through the crack. Once again gripped by the fear of the dark, his wife and son tried to get his attention, but John was consumed by that darkness emanating. From the opening, feeling a sinister energy, he squirmed and told his family that they should look outside and call the shelter, confessing that he felt sorry for the air too. However, if they didn't find it, they could just get the dog. At that moment, his son protested, asking how could this guy say that, since air was his best friend. His wife also remarked that he was being unreasonable and that this guy wasn't using his perfect judgment. Indeed, doubting he thought air was just a replaceable dog. Seeing his fear in the darkness, she decided she would personally go after the air, insisting that he just unlock the door or she would break it herself. John was distraught, poor guy, telling them to prepare, that he would be responsible for going down there. After all, his mission was to protect the family, so it was him who had to go down. He grabbed the metal pipe and a flashlight as he prepared to descend the stairs, scared to death. Still before leaving, he told his wife that no matter how long it took, she shouldn't come down after him or call the police. Confused, Nick asked the reason for this prohibition, and John explained that if the police showed up there, they would go down to the basement, which couldn't happen. John's wife insisted that he was overreacting just by going to the basement. She admitted to being disgusted by rats, but even so, it was just a nuisance. Ignoring her remark, John continued down. He thought he couldn't tell Lucy and Nick about his Uncle Edmund, as they would surely suggest that they should move, something that was far from affordable. Thus, he locked the door behind him so Nick or Lucy wouldn't follow him. But as he did this, the fear of the darkness began to attack him again, making his body tremble as his eyes scanned the environment. His family was quite worried to see him in the woods, while Lucy screamed for him to take deep breaths, trying to bring him back to himself. She assured him that he would get through this, and finally, John started to calm down and breathe normally. Armed with the flashlight, he let out a sigh and promised that he would be okay, asking them not to worry. He returned to the basement, starting down the stairs. As they watched, Nick asked their mother when their father would be back, since it had already been 8 hours since he went down. Lucy was standing in front of the door, saying she was getting desperate and was about to call the police. My brother, who was afraid of that basement, heard a voice echoing from the entrance, remembering that John had asked not to use the phone. Then, John appeared at the door, dirty and exhausted, carrying Omar's body and stating that they should be worried about him. Surprised, Nick and Lucy were stunned to see his condition, with Lucy angrily shouting about how they could be worried about him looking like that. But Nick, on the other hand, was devastated to see the dog in his arms, all hurt and injured. Poor thing. He lunged towards John, pleading for him to wake up as tears streamed down his face, but Omar did not respond. Poor thing. John was also deeply shaken, while Lucy was completely lost. Amid all that chaos, Nick wouldn't stop screaming and crying upon seeing his friend in that situation. Finally, Lucy asked John what had happened in the basement. Unable to elaborate an answer, a faint smile appeared on John's face, making Lucy feel overwhelmed with a whirlwind of emotions. They then placed Omar's broken body on a towel, with Nick still crying for him. The protagonist declared that the next day they should take Omar, the dog, to the famous Père Lachaise cemetery, where they would buy a grave for 25 francs and put his picture in that space. Nick, still in tears, agreed with that idea, admitting that R deserved that tribute at least. But then John decided to suggest that, after this, they stop by the animal shelter and bring a new dog home, joking about getting a Maltese, which is very cute. On the other hand, Lucy still seemed to be in shock, unable to process everything that had happened so quickly. She remained in a heavy silence, but eventually silently agreed with John's suggestion. Still, there was a determination inside, her that insisted on uncovering the whole truth. She questioned John about what had happened down there, but he just looked at her and said there was nothing, well, nothing at all. This made Lucy even more irritated, and in an outburst, she yelled, asking if he had any idea how she was feeling at that moment. Looking at the dog's body, it seemed like it had gone through a real massacre, and she wondered what exactly had happened to her friend at that moment. John touched her head, stating that, as the notary had told him, the basement was infested with rats and those monsters had wreaked havoc on the poor dog. Worried, Lucy asked about John's condition, but he just smiled weakly, lacking confidence. Both Nick and Lucy now watched as John recounted that, from the rat's point of view, he was much larger than a dog, and that they had been frightened. Lucy was in shock, shouting that this didn't make sense, demanding to know what he had been doing there for a full 8 hours. She was furious and wanted to know what was in that damned basement, while Nick looked at his father with concern. John confessed that he also didn't know what was inside because he had never managed to get all the way to the end. Lucy, mouth agape, asked how he hadn't gone to the bottom after spending 8 hours down there. He said the basement seemed endless and kept going down without stopping. She was amazed that he hadn't managed to reach the bottom, even after walking for that long, and commented that the basement really was something. Joan revealed that he was going to continue, but it was then that he found R and decided to stop, seeing that the animal's body was bloody. He assumed that the heir had fought bravely, and for such a small dog, having resisted for so long was remarkable, right? Right, Lucy? He questioned why he had stopped, wondering if he had reached halfway. John admitted he didn't know, but fear paralyzed him, reminding him how he always struggled with darkness and violence. She stated that anyone would have turned back since one cannot simply move forward into complete darkness. The thought of Lucy and Nick didn't let John go deeper into that darkness or feel that he was heading towards death. His words worried both of them. Lucy hugged him, apologizing for pushing him so hard, and assured him that it was all over. She suggested they seal the door tightly and never talk about what happened. However, John insisted that what happened there was not over. Confusing Lucy, he described an area in the basement with walls stained red, where he couldn't move forward. Anyone in his place would have done the same. He always hated that darkness and violence. He was terrified just thinking about that darkness. He was still trembling, but he couldn't stop. He believed he might be close to the end. Lucy's response was a direct question, and was implying that she wanted to go back there. John confirmed that he wished to as well, as he believed that this was the path his uncle Edmund had taken. Lucy raised an eyebrow, surprised by Edmund's mention, but John began to explain that there was something in what he did down there that he needed to discover. Lucy was completely stunned. She stated that John really loved her and Nick, and that he would never go down there again. Nick also begged his father not to go, but he gave them a blank look, saying there was no way. He knew he had always been a coward, and that when he felt danger, he would stop, abandoning everything. It was simply what he was. He never had the courage to face something risky to the end, and had never accomplished anything he could call success in life. He could never move on and now regretted not having stayed at the 7 Locks Company. Since all the skills he learned there were of no use to him now, he should have ventured into a dangerous neighborhood. Perhaps then he would know how to handle that violence. Instead, he continued to pretend in any complicated situation, becoming a jailwalk ignorant of reality. Lucy interrupted, saying that he was talking nonsense, but John argued that it was not nonsense. He knew he couldn't live locked up forever. This basement was his chance to break out of that little shell. If he didn't see that by the end, he would be condemned to face a coward every time he looked in the mirror. Lucy understood that she couldn't stop him and asked to go with him, but John insisted that she stay. This was his mission, his path to follow. No one could interfere. Curious, he asked if she understood. Then he turned to Nick, trying to calm him by offering a riddle. Upon hearing this, Nick paused his crying. John offered him 6 matches and challenged the boy to form 4 equilateral triangles with them, emphasizing that he should think outside the box and never shy away from the answer. It was crucial to think differently, and thus he would succeed. The riddle of the 6 matches brought a brief moment of calm for Nick. The shock and sadness of seeing the war return like a lifeless body were a little farther away, but worry still dominated Lucy. That night, the couple had a heated argument, but John stood firm, not uttering a word about the basement or his intentions. The next day, he repaired the gap in the iron door of the basement, restored the lock, and attached the only key to a cord that hung around his neck. His attitude left his wife and son in shock. However, at least the door was locked again. But in the depths of darkness, a rumble persisted, as the earthquake of 327 caused the cave ceiling to collapse upon him and his enemies. Seizing the confusion, 327 cut through, shedding the ants as he ran. The ceiling continued to fall, but he managed to leap over the debris. Reaching a flight away from the chaos, however, before he could escape, the debris fell in front of him, completely blocking his path. 327 found himself surrounded, but this was not the end. The ground began to crack beneath his feet, and he plummeted along with the rest of the nest. The earthquake, repeating, had devastated part of the city, causing the ants to release pheromones of fear. In spite of everything, 327 managed to land safely, with his wings, while his companions were not so lucky, crashing down to the ground. The tremor had saved him from the clutches of the killer, but now everyone was in danger. The workers began to move the eggs to safe areas, and the soldier ants organized for battle, while 327 pressed on. Eventually, they would manage to reach a safe zone, but no one knew if the earthquake was over. Before anyone could speak, the ground started shaking again, and the ceiling above him opened up, letting in the light. As the ceiling was pierced, the ants from the upper levels began to fall, generating uncertainty among them about what was truly invading the city. And then, a colossal tentacle interrupted the city, tearing everything in its path. The ants were in shock upon seeing that colossal, pink, and slimy appendage invading their home. "Oh, what a strange affair, my brother." But before he could make a decision, the tentacles began to thrash about like uncontrolled whips, taking out many ants at once. The brave soldiers charged at the tentacle, biting with all their strength, causing it to writhe in pain and retreat to the hole from which it had come. However, as soon as it pulled back, it attacked again. The remaining ants began to sound the alarm, warning everyone to take shelter, but the tentacle swept past them and focused on 327. Just as it was about to capture him, a soldier ant passed in front of his face, pushing 327 away from the tentacle, sending him running as the alarm sounded once again. The ceiling trembled once more as a massive monster was in full destruction. Crushing the soldier ants with its tongue, the monster grabbed a large number of ants, swallowing them in one gulp. That scene was devastating, causing a sinister understanding among them. They were facing man, the gray-headed woodpecker. Ave Maria. I thought it was an anteater. The scientific name of that creature was Picus canis. In Korea, it was a common resident bird and a Euro-Asian species of the woodpecker family. Those birds, with a little red spot on their heads, were males, while those without spots were females. They used to be fans of ants, often finding them on the ground, licking them up with their tongue. In a new strike, the woodpecker spat out its tongue, breaking apart a group of ants. 327 watched as he grabbed and devoured ants as if they were snacks, swallowing them whole. And he didn't stop there. He attacked again, crushing even more ants to satisfy his hunger. Warning, it was a level 3 emergency alert. All the ants began to sound an emergency signal. Quickly, they started to descend with the eggs, sending soldier ants to protect them. The shooters gathered and aimed at the woodpecker's mouth. They began to climb up the bird's body, clinging to its feathers as they formed, with the firm leadership of the troop commander. All the ants released a rain of formic acid against the bird. This did not go unnoticed by the woodpecker, who screamed in pain. The ants, mercilessly, continued to launch their acid, burning his feathers and responding to the nerves of the unfortunate creature. But it didn't stop there. They soon started to bite his flesh, with the cries of the woodpecker echoing as he tried to defend himself, flapping his wings against the nest in a desperate battle. The ants were determined to invade the giant's body. They found an opening, and with the call, each one began to fit into the monster's entrails. Then, they entered through the wound that had opened. The struggling woodpecker was completely distracted by the ants on his neck that were biting him. One of them finally managed to penetrate, piercing the flesh of the bird and causing blood to gush out. The skin of the throat opened up, and the ants began to enter, while a stream of red blood flowed from the wound. Once they finished releasing alarm pheromones, it indicated that they had the upper hand in the battle. They went for the woodpecker's innards, and the attack intensified. They found some ants that had been swallowed still alive and rescued them. Now they were in the intruder's head, looking for a way to reach the brain, and had the audacity to follow an artery, taking advantage of the direct flow of blood from the heart, preparing for the great attack on the nervous center. The woodpecker, feeling the pain, cried out again, while a second group of ants that had invaded through the lung poured formic acid. There, they would not give any quarter. Armed with powerful jaws, they broke through the esophagus and met up with their comrades, climbing through the round orifice. Meanwhile, the soldiers that had entered from below were devastating every organ they encountered: gizzard, liver, heart, spleen, pancreas. They were destroying the monster's internal fortresses, one by one. An ant, amid the chaos, broke a vein, and the area was flooded with blood. The leader then instructed everyone to be careful not to harm muscles and nerves too much. He emphasized that if they weren't cautious, they could injure themselves with the involuntary attacks of the flesh. He also reminded them to avoid the parts containing bile and digestive juices, because let's face it, touching there would be a total disaster. Finally, the units that had entered through that strange and round path found themselves in the creature's kidney region. The monster's heart was still beating, but the fire ants had won this. They had defeated the woodpecker, the predator that once hunted them, now having become the prey. Ants from all over that city gathered to invade the immense bird and began to feast on its flesh. It wasn't long before the tunnels of the colony were filled with ants carrying feathers and plumage as trophies. The builder ants. For their part, they were already rushing to start the repairs, raising the roof and restoring everything that had broken. Thus, once again, the civilization of ants was being built. Understanding this requires a journey hundreds of millions of years back in time to when life first emerged on our planet. Insects were the first inhabitants, but let's face it, survival was not favorable. They were small and fragile, easy targets for predators. To stay alive, some of them decided to produce an absurd number of eggs, hoping that at least a fraction of their offspring would survive. Others decided to protect themselves with poisons, becoming fearsome creatures. Some produced substances so unpleasant that predators gave up trying to eat them, while others camouflaged themselves, masquerading as grass or tree bark. However, the termites, poor things, up until that moment doomed to become snacks in the primitive jungle, found a clever solution. They stopped fighting alone and united in a true empire, convinced that if they fought together, the attack would become much more complicated. This strategy for survival was based on a complex social organization where termites demonstrated that they knew how to work together. They were the pioneers in building a society, the true masters of this planet. When this crosses Edmund's mind, he closes another chapter of his encyclopedia of relative and absolute knowledge. A guy said that Edmund Wills did not leave the best of legacies in that place, and thus, upon leaving, no one was particularly keen on keeping him. However, he seemed to have some tricks up his sleeve. In fact, the guy once developed a food bacteria, one that made yogurt smell nice. The fellow mentioned that the guy had flashes of genius in chemistry, but people said that this was not so frequent. It was as if it appeared and disappeared. John, curious, wanted to know if the relationship between them was tense, and the man explained that it was more appropriate to say that Edmund didn't fit in very well, calling him a loner. The bacteria he had developed brought enormous profits to that company, but no one gave him real recognition. John began to wonder if the man could clarify what he meant. The man replied that in any team there has always been a leader, but Edmund couldn't handle that well. Typical of intelligent people, he hated hierarchies and looked down on managers. According to him, these managers were only there to give orders, without a shred of critical thinking, and everyone was caught in the dynamics of sucking up to their superiors. Well, on the other hand, Edmund seemed arrogant, which ended up irritating his colleagues. Interestingly, his co-workers felt more contempt for him than for the very superiors he challenged. So, John questioned what had happened when Edmund left the company, and the man fell silent for a moment. He shared that there had been a misunderstanding between Edmund and one of his executives over some matter, and in that case, Edmund was absolutely right. He recalled that, noticing the executive was snooping around his office, Edmund set a trap and gave him a well-deserved lesson. However, no one stood by Edmund. When he saw that everyone was fervently siding with the executive, he had no choice but to leave. This left John confused, remembering that the man had said Edmund was right. The man reflected that sometimes it is much wiser to act like a coward for someone you know, even if you don't like them, than to risk exposing yourself for someone you barely know, even if you have some sympathy. Edmund had no friends in that place. He never had a snack or a drink with them, always seemed to live in a world apart. This revelation left John stunned. He wondered why the man was confessing his cowardice to him. Well, the man said that now that Edmund was dead, he couldn't help feeling that he had wronged him, and since John was his nephew, sharing this story with him could bring some peace to his soul. Then with that, John left the building. Sweet milk. I send it to the National Scientific Research Center of the Fontainebleau Entomology Center. There, he asked the professor if he knew him from when Edmund was in Africa. The professor confirmed this and remarked that Edmund carried deep wounds in his soul, like the kind you don't give a like, you know? That left me with a huge wound, you see? So hit that like button, alright? Just to remind you, this was because of his wife's death. After this tragedy, he dedicated his life to the study of insects. John asked Professor Daniel why he had chosen insects as the focus of his study. Daniel explained that insects held enormous importance, as they had always fascinated humans throughout history. He asserted that, since ancient times, our ancestors feared flies, thinking they were carriers of diseases, and disliked fleas because they triggered itching on the skin. They feared spiders because of their bites and hated weevils that fed on grains. These ideas were passed down from generation to generation. Despite being smaller and more fragile than humans, both sides felt threatened and antagonized each other. In the end, it all ended, up in the stomachs of the smaller creatures. This intrigued John as he heard Professor Daniel explore this perspective, as he had never thought of the subject this way before. For a long time, insects had been portrayed as the most harmful creatures. Daniel alluded, for example, that it was no coincidence that Beelzebub, one of Satan's servants, was depicted with the head of a fly. John noted that ants were viewed more positively than flies, but Daniel emphasized that this varied by culture. The Talmud, ants symbolized honesty. In Tibetan Buddhism, they served as a critique of materialism. However, among the Bu people of the Ivory Coast, there was a belief that if a pregnant woman were bitten by an ant, she would give birth to a child with an ant's head. Some Polynesian tribes even considered ants as little deities. John mentioned that he listened to his uncle, who used to investigate bacteria, questioning Daniel about why he had abandoned that line of work. Daniel replied that, compared to his deep dive into insects, what Edmund did with the bacteria was merely a drop in the ocean, especially when considering his research on ants, something that surprised John. In the meantime, 327 confirmed that the two killers, with their stone scent already dissipated, had likely been crushed by the collapsing earth. Now, he let out a sigh of relief, although he knew this was just the beginning. Those damned ones had erased his pheromone, and that of the Federation. Any ant that encountered 327 recognized him as an intruder. Without any warning, they could attack with formic acid and try to crush his head with their jaws. He couldn't believe it had all come to this point, thinking it was all because of those damned two soldier ants that smelled of stone. Frustration took over 327, who questioned why he had done something so crazy. He concluded that these ants must be completely insane, as there was no way to act that way unless they were deranged. However, in 227, he remembered that even the ants signaling level 3 were exhibiting some rather strange behavior. That was when an idea crossed his mind. Those two stone-smelling ants were different. These ants weren't crazy. No, to tell the truth, they seemed fully aware of what they were doing. When the genetic sequence fails, it is capable of triggering a psychological outbreak. It's like cells attacking each other within the same organism. The ants that were tending to the wounds called those others cancerous. He recalled what cancer was and the rotten smell coming from that group. It must be the stench of the disease, right? This was something he had to report immediately. First, he had the secret weapon of the dwarf ants, and now these cancer cells from Belacan. Before Before anything else, 327 needed to ensure his safety. The only ant that could recognize him by infrared without depending on scent was the mother queen. The queen's forbidden zone, where she hid, would be filled with soldier ants, but there was no way to enter otherwise. After all, Queen Speedcorn had mentioned that many times. The most dangerous place was the safest, and thus 327 shot towards his next objective. At the end of the narrow, dark corridor, a wooden fortress appeared before him. He had reached the forbidden zone. Thanks to the pine log, the city could protect itself from the storm and also from floods, with the queen's residence and precious food reserves right inside. After the progenitor velociraptor arrived in this area 5,000 years ago, the first trouble it faced was termites, a long and tedious battle that took a millennium. The Belican ants emerged triumphant, conquering that land, but the guys were surprised to come across their new home. The pine log opened doors to new ideas and urbanism and architecture with the growth of the fire ants. They began to dig even deeper, following the roots that spread through the forbidden zone. The Bellicone nest was now home only to the queen mother and the most selected sentinel ants. The rest of the colony lived in the surroundings. 327 approached the log carefully, avoiding making noise, as any sound could reveal him. He waited for no soldier ants to be around until he found an ant blocking the entrance. These doorkeeper ants were genetically manipulated to have large, flattened heads. When positioned to obstruct a passage, their heads fit perfectly, making it seem like there was indeed a nail hammered there, acting as living doors. They had proven their worth for 780 years. During the invasion of the yellow ants, all surviving Bellicone took refuge in the forbidden zone, and the doorkeeper ants meticulously sealed every entrance. It took a long time for the yellow ants to force their way through these living barricades. They not only blocked access, but also used their brute strength to repel the invasion. Eventually, the yellow ants managed to break through the chitinous heads of the doorkeepers and got inside, but their sacrifice was not in vain. They bought the necessary time for the allied cities. They gathered strength and came to his aid, and there was 327 face-to-face with one of those gatekeeper ants. The gatekeeper ant revealed that 327 had no passage pheromone, labeling him an intruder, but 327 asked her to just listen and check his antennas. The gatekeeper stood firm, reaffirming that an intruder had invaded the forbidden zone, questioning 327 about what he was doing there. Trying to approach, that gatekeeper ant could only remain on alert against an invisible enemy, but against a worker ant that had night vision, thanks to its infrared port eyes, luck might be on his side. He saw 327 lamenting that situation, as he had no alternative. Then, with a quick movement, he attacked the gatekeeper's jaws, which began to topple slowly. But, as rigor mortis began to set in, the gatekeeper's body ultimately made it even harder to open the entrance. In the end, 327 spread formic acid on the gatekeeper's forehead, murmuring that he was very sorry but had to do this. With a stubborn head, it did not melt right away, forcing him to use 4 sprays of that formic acid. And finally, my friend, that passage opened. Our boy decided to think that the door had simply broken, trying to convince himself that it was just a door and he was overcoming an obstacle, moving to warn his clan about the impending danger, putting his own life at risk. And so our boy tried to deceive himself, thinking he had merely shattered that barrier that stood in his way. After all, he couldn't think otherwise, could he? Because he was a being of his own kind, and he moved forward. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, share, comment down below, and smash that video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.